Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Durham Devils Club podcast. I'm your host, Josh Cox. I do not have any of my co hosts with me today. Brian, Scott, and Jamie are not with us today, but we did decide to bring on a special guest. This is being recorded the week leading up to the Duke Notre Dame game, homecoming there for Duke. And we've got Brady Quinn with us here for a special episode of the Durham Devils Club podcast. We want to thank you for listening and for subscribing and being a part of Duke's NIL collective. Brady, thanks for coming on with us today, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Josh. Obviously, I got to say this, though. Go Irish. It's a big week for us. We got to bounce back after a disappointing loss this past week versus Ohio State.
Hey, listen, understandable. I know Duke. I think Duke fans were all hoping that Notre Dame would come in flying high at 5-0, a little overconfident, and now, unfortunately, I believe for Duke, Notre Dame's coming in 4-1 and pretty angry.
Yeah, that's probably a fair way of assessing it or putting it. And I always felt like this is more maybe a high school thing, but you always felt disrespected when some teams scheduled you for your homecoming. So, I mean, usually that's the game you're like chalking up as a win. So I don't know, maybe that's how Duke feels, but I remember like I took that personal in high school. And I remember I'd always point that out every time we beat someone when we played them on their homecoming.
Yeah, it's funny because we are Florida State's homecoming this year. We know that, and so we're probably going to take a little bit of that into consideration. We go down there and do our best. But yeah, thank you for coming on here. Obviously, Durham Devils Club. These are supporters and members supporting the NIL collective here at Duke. Get everybody up to speed. I know you work with Notre Dame's NIL. Tell us what you do with them and how that operates up there a little bit.
Yeah, so I started Friends of the University of Notre Dame, a 501c3 nonprofit to help support student athletes at the University of Notre Dame in regards to utilizing their name, image, and likeness to promote, educate, and inform about various charitable causes. So this has been running now for about 2 years. We try to support all the programs there at the university. And we feel like what we've been able to create is really in the likeness of what the University of Notre Dame really embodies. And that's trying to be a force for good, especially once you leave Notre Dame, but trying to, inform, educate, and promote and draw attention to various charitable causes that our student athletes feel passionate about.
Yeah, I love that. And here at Duke, there's a couple of different arms of the NIL, and one of them, the one that actually got up and running, I believe, first was that nonprofit side of really being able to get in the community and helping out in ways. And we're going to talk a little about that in a little bit. And actually, kind of our first talking point. Actually, I'll go ahead and ask that. What are some opportunities that NIL collectives in general can provide to players that maybe the common fan, is not aware of?
Yeah, it all depends on the type of formation of a collective, right? From a for-profit standpoint, really the opportunities are limitless. The NCAA states, and depending on state NIL laws, the student athlete just has to do something in order to be compensated for something. The same could be said to a degree about a nonprofit entity. The only difference in that case is that a student athlete would have to be paid fair market value for what their services are. So there's really not many limitations outside of what's stated by the NCAA or what's out there as your state NIL law, which sometimes can trump the NCAA's guidance. That's kind of what makes this whole thing a little bit confusing and messy. Is we don't have any sort of federal law that's overseeing all of this on a state-by-state basis. The state laws differ, or in some states like the state of Indiana, there is no NIL laws. So the universities are, unfortunately, they have to abide by NCAA guidance, and they have to interpret the NCAA guidance how they see fit. So, for example, University of, or I should say Indiana University and the University of Notre Dame might have differing opinions on what the NCAA guidance is and what is permitted and what is not permitted. And that's why there probably needs to be some sort of overseeing body, whether that be federal legislation or some sort of entity that's created to then oversee all of this to level the playing field. I mean, in some states, you've got the ability to pay high school student athletes before they've even necessarily gone into college, and that can become kind of a dangerous thing. In some states, especially the state of Missouri, this just recently happened. They passed a law allowing these student athletes to be compensated before they're even enrolled in the school, which also is different than what you'll see from NCAA guidance. So it's a pretty crazy world as far as NIL goes. But having a collective understanding what the NCAA states, what the state NIL laws are at the moment, obviously are paramount to anything else.
Yeah, for sure. I know down here with Duke, there's some charitable work that's able to be done. Duke Children's Hospital is a big one. The Ronald McDonald House is right on campus. I'm at Duke Durham Rescue Mission, who serves the addicted in Durham. And so I think a lot of times people think, NIL, and they simply think of player benefit. And that, obviously, that's a major part of NIL. But these other opportunities that I believe your organization also works with, what are some of the things specifically that you guys do there, as far as the charitable aspect with the players?
Yeah, so we work obviously with a bunch of different charities throughout the South Bend area. We also work with charities that go back to a lot of the players' local communities, and there are some that are national. So it all kind of varies depending on the level of what we're doing. But the reality is, what these student athletes are providing is increased exposure, and not only for that nonprofit, which helps for example, if you're talking about social media postings and driving traffic, click through rates, impressions, improved donation, and really just exposure in general. All those things are incredibly impactful when you're providing them for to a nonprofit where they're not having to pay anything out of pocket for it. And on top of it, there's donations that come alongside that. So there's a value there that I think is pretty well stated and put out there, and can be amplified through the student athletes following and their own brand, co-branded with that nonprofit. So there's a lot of power in some of the different opportunities that can happen in a nonprofit space. And I think more than anything else too, for us, at least the student athletes at the University of Notre Dame, we really want them to feel and understand that like they are creating a brand for themselves. And it's about being that student athlete at Notre Dame, but it's also about being a force for good and what that good is to them and what they want to continue to move on to in life, and what they want to continue to support. So, we feel like it fits the model of what we're looking for from our students, and really our student athletes in this case, and kind of coupled with a lot of the mission of what the University of Notre Dame, really is. God, country, Notre Dame.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That completely makes sense too, because Duke has a future initiatives program. Terrell Smith works with that, and he speaks to the fact that you are coming to Duke, and you kind of fall somewhat under the Duke brand, but while you're falling under the Duke brand, you are creating your own personal brand, right? And you are
That's right.
creating those things that you value, not only just as a university, but as an individual. And so NIL could definitely help there, right?
No, 100%. I mean, I think of it this way: like when I walk around, people look at me like, "Hey, Notre Dame quarterback." Like that's so they, even if they forget my name or they're like, "Oh, I know that he was a Notre Dame quarterback." Like that's how you're going to be recognized and identified with. And I think if you can take that branding and you can combine it with a nonprofit, for me, I have the Third and Goal Foundation, right? So I support veterans, and hopefully, when people recognize me, they understand my passion for our troops, for the brave men and women out there that serve our country, and the ties to that, the fact that it's part of my family's history. So, all those things are important to me. I hope that's what a lot of our student athletes are able to get out of a lot of the works that we're creating and providing for them.
And by the way, that's 3ng.com, I believe, is the website there. If you haven't checked that out, that's Brady's Foundation. Works a lot with veterans and other things like that. In fact, on the Section 17 podcast that released this past week, Brady goes into detail a lot about what that organization does. So 3ng.com. Brady, it's been about 2 years, like you mentioned, with your organization, but even NIL in general was legalized basically a little over 2 years ago. Oh, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, but what have been some of the changes that have already taken place kind of in the space? And then what have you learned the most, right? In being in that space for 2 years, what have you learned the most, and kind of how has it shifted even early on in the NIL world?
Yeah, I think what we learned early on is that it's kind of the wild, wild west. There's not a lot of guidance and direction in the NCAA because of the Supreme Court ruling that was 9-0, is worried about potential lawsuits, and so they can't oversee it or really hammer down anything with an iron fist because they're concerned about that. There's a need for federal guidance, or them getting involved to a degree, just because of how lopsided the landscape is. I mean, initially you had states implementing NIL laws, and then as they saw other states who maybe didn't enact their NIL law first, they either amended or changed those laws to be more competitive. Because you've got university officials who are like pleading with the state officials, saying, like, we're not going to be able to recruit and compete at the same level as this school, and that sort of thing happens at the state level. And so now you've got these varying state laws from state to state. that aid certain schools in recruiting. And I think what I've learned most is, look, before NIL was even enacted, there's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be people who do things that are under the table or are against NCAA rules. And that's in any industry, that's in any business you're going to be in. You have to make a choice. When you want to create an NIL program, you have to take into account what you're representing, the university you're representing, the people you're representing, whether that be investors, if it's a for-profit entity, or a donor base, if it's a nonprofit entity. You have to take all those things into consideration as far as how you're operating and what you're doing and doing things the right way. So that's probably what I've learned most, honestly, is that, it's kind of like any other new venture or new industry that start up, is there's always going to be some bad actors. You have to make a decision, a choice of how you want to operate within that space.
And you spoke to this a little bit, but maybe elaborate. Why is it important for universities like Duke? You're thinking of Duke specifically, to organize right in the NIL space, because you mentioned the Wild Wild West. You mentioned some of maybe the bad actors. Why is it important for Duke's collective to be organized and run in a proper way, especially moving forward, as regulations could be on the way? Who knows?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons why. I mean, the first is, I think when you're a smaller institution in regards to student enrollment, and you look at some of the higher academic institutions that are also extremely competitive in sports, I'll just be honest, you're going to play the recruiting game at a disadvantage. You can't let in every single recruit that you'd like to get, because either they can't qualify into the university, or they're not going to be able to last. I mean, that's just the reality of it, right? At Notre Dame, you have to go to class. We don't have online education. So, that's not going to be, in the best interest of every single recruit out there that wants to go play football at a high level. So, for a place like Duke, you've got to be organized. You've got to be able to utilize what is a strong alumni base, a very affluent alumni base, and do it in a way that is true to Duke, to be able to be competitive and remain competitive in this space. Because if you don't, you'll get left by the wayside. And it only takes a few years. And look, I hate bringing this up, because I don't want to look. Everyone's got a choice to make in how they want to operate and how they want to handle things. You look at a place like Clemson, though, a team that Duke was able to beat week one, and their head coach in football has been very adamant about not wanting to be as big of a player in transfer portal, not wanting to be as big about NIL, and because of that, I think you see them kind of slipping and falling behind by the wayside in the past few years. Whether that's in recruiting, whether that's been performance on the field, but all those things add up. And it's not anything illegal. This is all legal. And so if you don't take advantage of the opportunity, you will get left behind. You have to adapt. Otherwise, you suffer the consequences of potentially dying.
Yeah, and speaking of the transfer portal, you mentioned Clemson and their lack of willingness to really participate there. But how does the NIL space? I mean, obviously recruiting is still important, right, from that high school level. But nowadays, with the way that people can transfer, and I know the NCAA is trying to ratchet down a tad bit on that. But how important is the NIL space in the transfer portal specifically?
Well, for a lot of these kids, I mean, that's what they're looking for now. The only thing you can't do is you obviously can't incentivize them or entice them to go there based on any sort of NIL deal. So there could be something waiting for them when they get there, when they're enrolled, when they start participating and actually doing things in order to be compensated for their work. That's all legal. But as far as paying kids or enticing kids because of something, like that's where you cross the line. Yep. And so it's obviously become a big thing in the transfer portal, because if you're a kid who's showcased his abilities at one school, and you might have a better opportunity to go somewhere else and be compensated at a greater capacity because of it, those kids are going to take that opportunity to do it. And especially the kids that have an extra year of eligibility right now due to COVID. I mean, you're seeing as many 6-year quarterbacks as you will ever see. I mean, it's all these guys are like 24 years old. And I always sit there and look back, and I'm like, well, I was always 2 years in the league by now. Like, I already broke my right index fingers on IR. I mean, it's crazy to think how the COVID year and the extra year of eligibility has played a role too in the transfer portal, and also with NIL. And some of these players who maybe haven't had that breakout season or showcase the talent they want to, with the additional year at the college level, not only to make money while they're there, but also potentially improve their draft stock. So the transfer portal, in my opinion, could be fixed by making one window and not having two like they do right now. I think that would help clean some things up. And I think, you could probably do a few other things too to limit what's happening in the NIL space, in the transfer portal. But the reality is you need to have it to some capacity because of, how transient and how fluid the coaching situation can be with coaches moving from team to team.
Right, for sure. And like you said, not directly enticing people with NIL, but letting players understand that, like, if you were to come to this school, here are the NIL opportunities, right?
Exactly.
Here's the potential of what could happen here, and so
Yeah, like
very
you
important.
could show them and say, hey, so and so was here last year. This is what they were able to do. This is what they were able to make from it. This is what they were able to go and do. And that potentially could be you if you came to our school. You might have the opportunity to earn something like that. Like those are all conversations that are had between every kid that's in the transfer portal that's going to visit a lot of different schools out there. That's made possible because of NIL. Like people think that NIL has ruined the college sport. It's like not really. It's really more the transfer portal because if you didn't have a conduit to allow student athletes to put their name in there and then go look at every other school and essentially be a free agent, I mean, you really wouldn't have this issue. So there's clearly some things that need to be controlled and fixed. However, like I said before, I think everyone's worried about there being some sort of lawsuit or some sort of ruling that goes against the NCAA since they haven't had many wins lately.
Yeah. We're coming down towards the end here, and once again, Brady, thanks for coming on Durham Devils Club podcast. Thinking through this, for decades before the NIL became legal, before this all was kind of thrust upon everyone a little over 2 years ago, athletic departments had their own arms of fundraising, and there was a lot of donor. It was really concentrated giving into those spaces, and now you have diversity, right? You have different opportunities for donors that they don't just give to the athletic department, but now you could potentially give, you know, really if you want to look at it directly to the player benefit. Um, how's the tension there? I don't know. Here at Duke, the Iron Dukes have forever been, fundraising. I don't know what it's called up there, but that's the athletic department and different things. How is that? How is that moving forward? Is it new donors that are the answer to that? Is it diversifying current donors? How does that look?
Yeah, I think that's going to be specific to every school, and how they see fit, right? I mean, that's part of it, and how it works best for them. Clearly, every university is going to work, off their endowment and off the fundraising that comes in, and probably differently with private universities based on their donor base and the supporters that they have. So that's going to be, a specific question I think is going to be different depending on who you ask. I mean, you'd like every relationship, between a collective in the NIL space in the university in regards to fundraising. You'd like them to have I won't want to say a friendly relationship, but you'd like them not to be competing against one another. I think you add a lot of friction there. It makes it a little harder because the truth of NIL and collectives is, there's no greater way of helping impact your sports teams or your student athletes than NIL right now, and really collectives, because they're able to immediately help the kids who are there. When you're talking about donating money to a university or their athletics department, yeah, that might be great for a future building or for a future sports performance center or whatever else you're talking about, but that's not helping the current student athlete or the guy that wants to, potentially, come back for another season. And maybe they're looking at, what NIL opportunities could be there for them in the future. Like, all those things are things that help the immediacy of a student athlete or a sports program right now.
Mhm.
And so that's really what's kind of butting heads is there's been a traditional way of doing it. It's largely benefited the university kind of first before the student athlete. And now it's been flipped because of NIL. And there's a lot of uncomfort, I think, with some universities. But again, it all comes down to having the sort of relationship where everyone's understanding. If you want to win, you have to have an amicable relationship between both and being able to understand that, you've got to find other creative ways, whether it's an NIL or even in fundraising at universities, of being able to maintain that same funding. I mean, I would imagine, especially with the TV money that's being dealt out for in a lot of these conferences, that as that number continues to keep going up, you probably don't need to rely quite as much on a lot of your private donors. You can look at the TV revenue helping you cover a lot of that athletic budget that you've got every single year, and allow the some of the private donors to help out those collectives in the NIL world instead.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know, as you probably know better than I do, but the ACC, is in is in that tough situation right now with revenue and all of that compared to Big Ten and compared to SEC and others. But you're right. The more that those things come into consideration and become realities for these programs, the more maybe they can focus. So yeah, I think that's going to always be a little bit of a give and take, uh, between a university and between collectives, right? Between athletic departments and NIL collectives. And so, Brady, I appreciate you coming on. Any final thoughts for the Durham Devils Club? So Durham Devils Club, you may know this. I know you've worked with the Clunders, but Duke's NIL Durham Devils Club just started up in the middle of August, right, this year. So it's brand new. Anything you want to say? These are going to be those that hear this will be subscribers to Durham Devils Club at some level. Anything you want to say to them, kind of by way of encouragement or just information from being 2 years into it?
Yeah, I would say, look, if you have any questions, ask. I mean, first off, I know Chad and Lisa; they're great people. I love them to death. That's part of the reason why I'm on this right now. But there's a lot of people who have questions about it. A lot of people that don't feel necessarily comfortable with the NIL and the way it's set up. The reality is, this is the way of student athletics and college sports right now. And so, again, if you don't adapt to this new landscape, you'll get left by the wayside. And so it's really important that you become educated on the subject, you understand how you can help, and you connect with the right folks and helping them in that way. So again, I'm sure Lisa can answer a lot more questions than I can about your specific program. But great people, love the Clunders, and it's good to see that they're, at least Lisa is a part of it and obviously behind it.
Awesome. Well, Brady, thanks for coming on the Durham Devils Club podcast. As we said, we got a big game coming up this Saturday at Wallace Wade Stadium. All the best to you and the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, but we really hope that Duke leaves this somehow 5-0.
I know you do. But we can't afford to have a loss here. So I got to be pulling for my Irish. I wish I could be there. I'm hoping to make a trip up to Duke at some point in time in the future. It's going to probably have to be in the spring when I'm not as busy with everything going on right now. But it should be an electric atmosphere. I hope everyone enjoys it because I think it's the first time College Game Day has come to Duke, right?
It's the first time ever. We were one of the very select few that they had not been to Durham yet, and so this will be a first. So we're recording this on Monday. We don't even know where the setup's going to be. We don't know anything yet. We're just still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, well, look, I'm sure it'll be an awesome atmosphere. Congrats for the start so far for Duke in the season. It's fun. It's fun to see Coach Elko and the boys, and rather than those guys playing as well as they are right now.
Yeah, awesome. You can catch Brady on Fox every weekend. Some NFL games coming up as well. Brady, once again, thank you for coming on the Durham Devils Club podcast, man.
Thanks for having me on, Josh.
All right, man.